Welcome back to Sigil Sanctum, where we peel back the layers of Hollywood fiction to reveal the authentic, often more terrifying truths behind the occult entities that haunt our popular culture. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most misrepresented demons in modern cinema, Valac, or as the Conjuring franchise would have you believe, Valac the demonic nun. But here's what James Wan and his team won't tell you in their horror films. The real Valac is far more complex, far more ancient, and arguably far more dangerous than any CGI nightmare could ever be. Your name gives me dominion over you, demon, and I do know your true name. You are Valac the President, the Serpent Commander, the revealer of hidden treasures, the child with angel's wings who rides the two-headed dragon of Revelation. You are mentioned in no fewer than 7 major grimoires spanning 4 centuries. You command legions numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and you have been completely bastardized by modern entertainment. But before we exorcise the Hollywood lies and summon the historical truth, I want to know something. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Are you joining us from the foggy streets of London, where many of these grimoires were first translated into English? Perhaps you're watching from Salem, Massachusetts, where America's witch trials created their own dark legends? Or maybe you're tuning in from Rome, where the Catholic Church has spent centuries cataloguing and condemning these very texts. Drop your location in the comments below. I'm genuinely fascinated by how global our community of serious occult researchers has become here at Sigil Sanctum. Because here's the thing, Valak's influence extends far beyond any single culture or time period. This isn't some modern invention designed to sell movie tickets. We're talking about a supernatural entity whose name and attributes have survived over a millennium of religious persecution, manuscript copying errors, translation challenges, and now, Hollywood bastardization. Tonight, we're going to trace Valak's journey from his earliest appearances in medieval manuscripts through the golden age of Renaissance magic, into the hands of modern practitioners who still invoke his name for very specific, very real purposes. We'll examine the linguistic evolution that transformed Kula and doulas into Valac. We'll decode the symbolic meaning behind his appearance as a winged child riding a two-headed dragon. We'll calculate exactly how many demons serve under his command, and trust me, the numbers will shock you. We'll also confront the uncomfortable questions that serious demonologists must face. If Valac can truly reveal hidden treasures and command serpents, why isn't every occultist rich and surrounded by snakes? What do historical accounts tell us about actual encounters with this entity? And perhaps most importantly, what can medieval magical practices teach us about the psychological and spiritual technologies our ancestors developed to navigate the unknown? This isn't going to be another surface-level horror movie analysis. This is Sigil Sanctum, where we do the deep research that other channels won't touch. We're going to examine original manuscript sources, compare translation variants, analyze symbolic systems, and piece together a picture of Valac that's more complex and arguably more terrifying than any Hollywood interpretation, because it might actually be real. So grab your grimoires, light your candles, and prepare for a journey that spans centuries of magical tradition. Whether you're a skeptical historian, a practicing occultist, or just someone fascinated by humanity's relationship with the unknown, what you're about to learn will change how you think about both medieval magic and modern entertainment forever. Before we dive deeper into the abyss, if you're new to Sigil Sanctum, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Seriously, stop the video and do it now. We're building something unprecedented here. A community of serious researchers who refuse to accept Hollywood's sanitized version of occult history. Every subscriber helps us dive deeper, research harder, and bring you content that other channels simply can't or won't produce. Now, let's talk about what makes Valac special within the broader context of Goetic demonology, because understanding his place in the infernal hierarchy is crucial to understanding his historical significance and modern relevance. The term Goetic derives from the ancient Greek word Goetia, which originally meant sorcery, witchcraft, or divination, but it carried darker connotations than other Greek magical terms. While theurgia referred to divine or beneficial magic, Goetia implied something more dangerous, more transgressive, magic that crossed boundaries and challenged established order. This distinction matters because when medieval Christian scholars encountered these ancient Greek magical concepts, they weren't dealing with abstract philosophy. They were grappling with practical magical systems that people actually used. The grimoires that preserve Valak's name and attributes weren't written by academics in ivory towers. They were created by practitioners who believed they were documenting real supernatural entities with real power. The famous 72 demons of the Ars Goetia didn't materialize from thin air. Their roots trace back through a complex web of manuscripts, translations, and cultural exchanges that span over 1,000 years. The foundational text is the Testament of Solomon, likely composed between 100 to 1000 AD, though it claims to be the authentic work of the biblical King Solomon himself. Here's where things get historically murky and fascinating. The Testament of Solomon presents itself as a first-person account of how King Solomon bound and questioned demons during the construction of his famous temple. Solomon, according to this text, received a magical ring from the archangel Michael that gave him power over demonic entities. He used this ring not to banish demons, but to interrogate them, to learn their names, their powers, their weaknesses, and most importantly, how to use them for constructive purposes. This isn't the sanitized biblical Solomon of Sunday school. This is Solomon the magician, Solomon the demon binder, Solomon who made pacts with infernal powers to accomplish impossible architectural feats. The Temple of Solomon, in this version, wasn't just a religious structure, it was the product of supernatural labor, built by demons under divine compulsion. But here's what's crucial for understanding Valac. The demons described in the Testament of Solomon don't perfectly match the later Goetic lists. There's a process of evolution, expansion, and cultural adaptation happening across centuries. Medieval scholars weren't just copying ancient texts, they were synthesizing, interpreting, and sometimes creating entirely new demonic entities. This brings us to the question of hierarchy. Because Valak's rank as president isn't arbitrary, it reflects sophisticated medieval understanding of how power structures function. The demonic hierarchy described in Goetic texts mirrors feudal European political systems, kings at the top, followed by princes, presidents, earls, marquises, and so on down the chain of command. As a president, Valac occupies middle management in Hell's bureaucracy. He's not a supreme commander like King Belial or Prince Sitri, but he's also not a lowly earl or knight. This positioning is significant because it suggests Valac has both substantial power and specific limitations. He commands legions. We'll calculate those exact numbers later, but he also answers to higher authorities. The hierarchy also determines magical protocol. Different ranks of demons require different approaches, different offerings, different protective measures. A magician summoning a president like Valac would use different rituals than someone calling upon a king or a duke. These aren't arbitrary distinctions. They reflect centuries of accumulated magical practice and, according to believers, hard-won knowledge about how infernal entities actually behave. But here's where Valac becomes particularly interesting from a historical perspective. Unlike many Goetic demons who can be traced back to ancient Mesopotamian, Egyptian, or Greco-Roman deities, Valac appears to be a genuinely medieval creation. Entities like Baal, Astaroth, and Beelzebub are clearly demonized versions of older pagan gods. Their names, attributes, and even their symbolic associations carry forward ancient religious traditions. Valac doesn't fit this pattern. There's no clear ancient deity that transforms into this serpent-commanding, treasure-revealing, dragon-riding president of hell. This makes his development through medieval manuscript traditions particularly valuable for understanding how occult knowledge actually evolved, adapted, and spread through medieval European culture. The implications are staggering. Either medieval magicians were sophisticated enough to create entirely new spiritual technologies, or they were documenting encounters with entities that previous cultures hadn't catalogued. Both possibilities challenge conventional assumptions about medieval intellectual capabilities and spiritual sophistication. This is also where we need to address the uncomfortable question that serious researchers must confront. If these grimoires represent genuine magical knowledge accumulated over centuries, why do they contain so many inconsistencies, variations, and apparent errors? If Valac is real, why do different manuscripts give him different names, different legion counts, different specific powers? The answer, I believe, lies in understanding these texts not as perfect supernatural encyclopedias, but as practical working documents created by practitioners dealing with complex, dynamic spiritual phenomena. Just as modern scientists might describe the same physical phenomenon differently depending on their instruments, theoretical frameworks, or experimental conditions, medieval magicians might have encountered the same spiritual entity under different circumstances, leading to variations in description and understanding. This view treats grimoires as empirical documents, imperfect, culturally biased, but genuinely attempting to record and systematize spiritual encounters. It's a perspective that takes both the historical documents and the practitioners who created them seriously, without requiring modern readers to accept their supernatural claims at face value. The evolution of Valak's name through medieval and Renaissance manuscripts reads like a supernatural detective story, complete with false identities, mysterious disappearances, and dramatic transformations. But unlike fiction, this story reveals genuine historical processes that shaped how occult knowledge was preserved, transmitted, and transformed across centuries of cultural change. Our investigation begins in the 15th century with one of the most puzzling cases in demonological literature, the appearance of what seemed to be two separate demons in the Liber Officiorum Spirituum, the Book of the Office of Spirits. This crucial manuscript, compiled around 1445 to 1460, presents us with Kula and Doulas, entities that share remarkably similar descriptions but are listed as distinct demons with separate rankings and legion counts. Let me read you the exact descriptions because the similarities are impossible to ignore. Kula appears as a great prince who appeareth like a child, and hath with him wings like to a goshawk, and he rideth upon a dragon that hath 2 heads, and giveth true answers for hid treasures. Doulas is described as a great prince who appeareth like a child with wings like an angel, rideth upon a dragon having 2 heads, and giveth true answers of hid treasures, and keepeth all treasures where serpents or snakes be seen to appear. The additional details in Doulas's description, the emphasis on serpents and snakes, the role as keeper of treasures, suggest either a more complete version of the same entity or a deliberate expansion of Kula's attributes. But here's where it gets mysterious. Kula is ranked as the 21st or 22nd demon, depending on the manuscript version, while Doulas appears as the 25th. Modern scholars have proposed several theories to explain this duplication. The manuscript error theory. This suggests that a medieval scribe was working from multiple sources and accidentally included both a preliminary draft and final version of the same demon. Given the chaotic nature of medieval manuscript compilation, where scribes often worked from incomplete or damaged source materials, this explanation has merit. The source synthesis theory. Perhaps the compiler of the Liber Officiorum Spirituum was attempting to reconcile 2 different magical traditions that described the same entity under different names. Medieval scholars often tried to create comprehensive works by combining multiple sources, sometimes without realizing they contained duplicated information. The deliberate differentiation theory. Maybe Kula and Doulas actually represent 2 distinct aspects or manifestations of the same fundamental demonic archetype, like different faces of a single supernatural personality. The corruption theory. The names themselves might be corrupted versions of an original that was misread or misheard during transmission. Medieval Latin scripts often used abbreviations and contained letters that could be easily confused during copying. What makes this case particularly fascinating is what happens next in the historical record. When we examine the Munich Manual of Demonic Magic, compiled later in the 15th century, we find that both Kula and Doulas have disappeared entirely. In their place, we encounter a new entity, Volac. The Munich Manual describes Volac as appearing in the form of a boy with wings like an angel, riding on a 2-headed dragon and giving true answers to the fullness of hidden treasures. The description clearly synthesizes elements from both earlier entities, but the name represents a complete departure from previous traditions. This transformation raises crucial questions about how medieval magical knowledge was actually transmitted. Was Volac a new name revealed through magical practice? Did a scribe or magical practitioner decide to regularize the earlier confusion by creating a unified identity? Or does Volac represent a completely independent source that happened to describe similar phenomena? The linguistic analysis becomes even more complex when we trace the name through subsequent manuscripts. The 16th century physician and occultist Johann Weyer, in his influential Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum, lists our demon as Volac, without the H, maintaining the Munich Manual's nomenclature but modifying certain attributes. Then comes the revolution. The 17th century Ars Goetia, the most famous and influential grimoire in Western occult tradition, presents us with the explosion of naming variants for what is clearly the same entity. Depending on which manuscript version you examine, you might encounter Valac, Valac, Ualac, Valu, Valix, or even Valac. This proliferation of variants tells us something crucial about how these texts were transmitted. They weren't preserved in controlled scriptoriums with careful oversight. They were copied by individual practitioners, often working from memory or from damaged source materials, frequently adapting the text for their own use or understanding. The phonetic similarities between these variants suggest that much of the transmission was oral before being committed to writing. Valac and Valac are essentially the same name with different spelling conventions. Ualac represents a scribal attempt to capture a sound that doesn't quite fit standard Latin orthography. Valu might be a shortened form, while Valix could represent an attempt to create a more classical-sounding Latin ending. But Valac is different. It suggests either a serious copying error or possibly an entirely different linguistic tradition. The PH beginning implies Greek influence, while the other variants seem more Latin-oriented. This could indicate that our demon's name was circulating in multiple linguistic communities with different phonetic interpretations. What's particularly intriguing is how this naming instability contrasts with other aspects of Valak's description, which remain remarkably consistent across manuscripts. Whether you call him Kula, Volac, or Valac, he consistently appears as a winged child, riding a two-headed dragon, and specializing in hidden treasures and serpent mastery. This suggests that while scribes and practitioners might have been uncertain about pronunciation or spelling, they were quite certain about the entity's appearance and capabilities. The core identity remained stable, while the linguistic expression varied, exactly what we'd expect if these descriptions were based on consistent experiential reports rather than purely literary invention. The name game doesn't end with medieval manuscripts either. Modern practitioners have continued to adapt and modify Valak's name based on their own practices and insights. Some contemporary magicians prefer Valac following the Conjuring movies, while others insist on Valac as more historically authentic. Still, others have developed their own variations based on personal magical experiences. This ongoing evolution demonstrates that grimoire tradition isn't a static historical artifact. It's a living system that continues to develop as practitioners engage with it. The question isn't necessarily which name is correct, but rather which name creates the most effective connection between practitioner and spiritual phenomenon. From a historical linguistics perspective, Valak's name journey illustrates broader patterns in how esoteric knowledge was preserved and transmitted in pre-modern Europe. Like folk songs, medicinal recipes, or craft techniques, magical knowledge relied heavily on personal transmission between practitioners. The variations we see in grimoires reflect this human chain of teaching and learning, with all the imperfections and adaptations that such transmission involves. Now we come to the heart of what makes Valac genuinely fascinating from both historical and practical perspectives: his specific supernatural abilities and the symbolic system that medieval practitioners used to understand and categorize demonic powers. Because unlike the generic evil entities of Hollywood horror, Goetic demons like Valac were understood as specialized supernatural consultants with very particular areas of expertise. Valak's primary abilities, as described consistently across multiple grimoires, center on two seemingly unrelated domains: the revelation of hidden treasures and the command of serpents. But as we'll see, these specializations are more interconnected than they initially appear, and they reveal sophisticated medieval understanding of both practical magic and symbolic psychology. Let's start with the treasure-finding aspect, because this is where modern readers often stumble. When medieval and Renaissance practitioners wrote about hidden treasures, they weren't necessarily talking about buried pirate gold or lost hoards of coins, though those certainly could be included. The concept of treasure in magical contexts was far more expansive and psychologically sophisticated. Hidden treasures could refer to literal material wealth, lost or stolen property, buried valuables, concealed assets. Knowledge and information. Secrets that others wish to conceal, hidden documents, suppressed learning opportunities and possibilities, business prospects, romantic connections, career paths that weren't obvious, personal talents and abilities, undeveloped skills, hidden potentials, suppressed aspects of personality, spiritual insights, mystical understanding, religious revelations, esoteric wisdom. This multifaceted approach to treasure reflects medieval magical thinking, which didn't sharply separate material and spiritual concerns the way modern thought tends to do. A demon who could reveal hidden treasures was essentially a supernatural detective and career counselor rolled into one, an entity capable of exposing whatever was concealed, whether by human deception or cosmic obscurity. The practical applications were enormous. Medieval and Renaissance practitioners called upon Valac for assistance with legal investigations, uncovering evidence in disputes, revealing hidden assets during inheritance conflicts, commercial ventures, identifying profitable opportunities, exposing fraudulent business partners, personal relationships, understanding hidden motives, revealing deceptions in romantic or social situations, scholarly research, finding lost texts, understanding concealed meanings in complex works, spiritual development, accessing hidden aspects of religious or mystical traditions. But here's where Valak's serpent mastery becomes crucial, because in medieval symbolic systems, serpents weren't just dangerous reptiles. They were complex symbols representing wisdom, medicine, transformation, deception, and hidden knowledge. The serpent was simultaneously the wisest creature in Eden and the agent of humanity's fall. It was the symbol of medical healing, the caduceus, and of dangerous temptation. A demon who brings serpents unto the exorcist wasn't necessarily delivering literal snakes, though historical accounts suggest that sometimes did happen. More often, serpent mastery implied control over the serpentine aspects of existence. Healing knowledge, understanding of poisons and their antidotes, medical secrets, transformative processes, hidden wisdom, access to knowledge that others wished to conceal or that was naturally obscure. Deceptive situations, the ability to navigate complex social or political environments where people were being dishonest. Transformative power, assistance with personal change, spiritual development, alchemical processes. The connection between treasure finding and serpent mastery becomes clearer when we understand that both involve revelation, making visible what was previously hidden. Treasures are concealed wealth. Serpents often represent concealed wisdom or danger. Valac specializes in exposing concealment itself. The visual description that accompanies these abilities is equally symbolic. Valac appears as a child with angel's wings riding a two-headed dragon. Every element of this image carries meaning. The child represents potential, innocence, beginnings, the capacity for growth and learning. In magical contexts, the child often symbolizes the part of human consciousness that remains open to wonder and transformation. Angel's wings indicate divine or aerial nature, the ability to transcend normal limitations, connection to higher realms of knowledge and power. Two-headed dragon. This is perhaps the most complex symbol. Dragons represent primordial power, ancient wisdom, and often the union of terrestrial and celestial forces. The two heads suggest duality, the ability to perceive in multiple directions simultaneously, to understand both hidden and revealed aspects of situations. The dragon's two heads might specifically represent past and future perception, material and spiritual sight. Conscious and unconscious awareness, truth and deception recognition. From a practical magical standpoint, medieval practitioners who summoned Valac weren't just asking for generic supernatural help, they were requesting very specific services from an entity whose symbolic attributes suggested particular strengths. The childlike appearance implied that Valac could help with new beginnings or learning processes. The wings suggested he could provide elevated perspective or transcendent insight. The two-headed dragon indicated he could reveal information that required seeing beyond normal limitations. But let's address the elephant in the room. If Valac truly possessed these abilities, why weren't medieval magicians universally wealthy and wise? Historical records show us a more complex picture. Some practitioners did report significant successes, finding lost property, uncovering hidden information, gaining insights that led to material or spiritual advancement, but others reported mixed results, failure, or even dangerous consequences. This pattern suggests several possibilities. 1. Skill. Variability. Like any complex technology, successful demonic summoning might require considerable skill, experience, and favorable conditions. 2. Conditional cooperation. The entity might cooperate more readily with some practitioners than others, based on factors the grimoires don't fully explain. 3. Symbolic interpretation. The treasure revealed might often be metaphorical or psychological rather than literal material wealth. 4. Psychological mechanism. The ritual process might activate genuine psychological capacities for insight and problem-solving rather than involving actual supernatural entities. Modern practitioners who work with Valac report experiences that span this entire spectrum. Some describe dramatic breakthroughs in finding lost objects or uncovering important information. Others report more subtle benefits: enhanced intuition, improved research abilities, better recognition of deceptive situations. The legion count associated with Valac adds another dimension to understanding his power level. Numbers vary between sources, ranging from 20 to 38 legions, using the traditional calculation of 6,666 demons per legion, a number that appears in several grimoires. Valak's supernatural workforce ranges from approximately 133,320 to 253,308 lesser spirits. These aren't arbitrary numbers. They reflect medieval attempts to quantify spiritual authority. A demon with 38 legions under his command represents a substantial supernatural organization, capable of coordinating complex operations across multiple domains of reality. But perhaps most intriguing is how Valak's abilities seem designed for the specific needs of medieval and Renaissance society. In an era where information was scarce, wealth was often hidden, and social networks were crucial for survival, a supernatural entity specializing in revelation and hidden knowledge would have been enormously valuable. This raises the fascinating possibility that Goetic demons like Valac represent medieval magical technology specifically adapted to address the challenges and opportunities of medieval life. Whether interpreted as literal spiritual entities or as sophisticated psychological techniques, they demonstrate remarkable understanding of human needs and desires. The historical development of Valac as a documented supernatural entity provides us with a unique window into how medieval magical traditions actually functioned, evolved, and spread through European culture. Unlike many aspects of medieval occultism that remain shrouded in secrecy or lost to persecution, Valak's textual journey is relatively well documented, allowing us to trace not just the evolution of ideas but the social and intellectual networks that preserved and transmitted magical knowledge. The emergence of Valac in 15th-century grimoires coincides with a pivotal moment in European intellectual history, the Renaissance explosion of magical texts, when scholars were actively collecting, translating, and synthesizing occult knowledge from multiple cultural traditions. This wasn't random historical coincidence. It reflected deliberate efforts by Renaissance intellectuals to recover and systematize ancient wisdom they believed had been lost or suppressed. The 15th century marked the beginning of what historian Francis Yates called the Hermetic Revival, a cultural movement that sought to recover ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Hebrew magical traditions and integrate them with Christian theology and natural philosophy. Figures like Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, and later Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa weren't just scholars, they were magical practitioners attempting to reconstruct sophisticated spiritual technologies from fragmentary sources. The grimoires that preserve Valak's description emerged from this intellectual ferment. They weren't folk magic or peasant superstition, but learned magic, the work of educated men who could read Latin, Hebrew, and Greek, who had access to rare manuscripts, and who possessed the leisure and resources necessary for complex magical experimentation. This elite context helps explain several puzzling aspects of Valak's historical development. The fact that he appears to be a genuinely medieval creation, rather than a demonized ancient deity, suggests that Renaissance magicians were sophisticated enough to develop entirely new spiritual technologies. They weren't just preserving ancient traditions, they were actively innovating, creating new magical techniques adapted to contemporary needs. The scholarly networks that transmitted Valak's description were international and interreligious. Medieval and Renaissance magical texts circulated among Christian scholars, Jewish Kabbalists, Islamic magical practitioners, and even crypto-pagan intellectuals. This cross-cultural pollination helps explain both the sophistication of texts like the Ars Goetia and their complex relationship with orthodox religious traditions. Consider the linguistic evidence. Valak's name, evolution from Kula and doulas through Volac to Valac, reflects not just scribal errors but active scholarly interpretation. Medieval intellectuals routinely adapted foreign names to fit Latin grammatical patterns, created new terminology when existing words proved inadequate, and modified traditional formulations based on their own experimental results. The question of Valak's possible connection to the Slavic deity Veles deserves deeper historical analysis because it illustrates how magical traditions actually spread and adapted across cultural boundaries. Veles, also known as Volos, Velinas, or Vala, was indeed a major Slavic deity governing earth, water, livestock, forests, wealth, and the underworld. His associations with serpents, dragons, and treasure align remarkably with Valak's described attributes. The historical timeline makes this connection plausible. Slavic paganism persisted in Eastern Europe well into the medieval period, often syncretically blended with Christianity. Trade routes connected Western European scholarly centers with Slavic regions. Manuscripts and magical knowledge regularly crossed cultural and linguistic boundaries. However, the evidence for direct connection remains circumstantial. We have no smoking gun documents that explicitly describe the transformation of Veles into Valac. The linguistic connection, while suggestive, isn't definitive. And the geographical gap, most Valac manuscripts originate in Western Europe, while Veles worship was concentrated in Eastern regions, complicates any direct transmission theory. More likely, Valac represents a complex synthesis. Medieval Western European magicians may have encountered Slavic magical traditions, extracted certain concepts and techniques, and integrated them into their own grimoire tradition using Latin magical frameworks. This process of cultural translation and adaptation was common in medieval magical practice. But there's another possibility that serious historians must consider: independent invention. The attributes associated with both Velas and Valac, serpent mastery, treasure revelation, underworld connections, represent fairly universal human concerns. Societies worldwide have developed spiritual technologies for finding hidden wealth and understanding dangerous or transformative forces. Valac might represent Western European magical practitioners independently developing concepts that paralleled Slavic traditions without direct influence. The social context of medieval magical practice adds another layer to understanding Valak's historical significance. Grimoire magic wasn't performed by isolated hermits or desperate peasants, but by educated urban practitioners, clergy, physicians, scholars, merchants, and aristocrats who had both the literacy and resources necessary for complex magical operations. These practitioners lived in a world where information was genuinely scarce and valuable, where hidden wealth could mean the difference between prosperity and poverty, where social networks were crucial for survival, and where understanding deceptive or dangerous situations was a practical necessity. Valak's specializations in revelation and serpent mastery addressed real-world needs in ways that would have been immediately valuable to medieval urban professionals. The integration of angelic opposition in later grimoires, particularly Thomas Rudd's 17th-century version of the Ars Goetia, reflects the ongoing tension between magical practice and Christian orthodoxy. By providing each demon with an opposing angel, Rudd was attempting to create a Christianized magical system that acknowledged demonic power while maintaining divine authority. Valak's opposing angel, Yahel or Iahel, governs wisdom, tranquility, modesty, and virtue, essentially representing everything that serpentine cunning and treasure-seeking might corrupt. The pairing suggests sophisticated psychological understanding. Valac provides access to hidden knowledge and material success, but Yahel ensures that such power doesn't lead to spiritual corruption. This angelic framework wasn't just theological window dressing, it reflected genuine concerns among magical practitioners about the spiritual dangers of their work. Medieval and Renaissance magicians were well aware that seeking hidden knowledge and material power could lead to pride, deception, and spiritual degradation. The angelic oppositions provided both protective mechanisms and moral guidelines for magical practice. The survival and transmission of Valak's tradition through centuries of religious persecution demonstrates the remarkable persistence of magical knowledge. During the medieval and early modern periods, practicing magic could result in accusations of heresy, witchcraft, or demon worship with potentially fatal consequences. Yet grimoires continued to be copied, preserved, and transmitted through underground networks of scholars and practitioners. This persistence suggests that the knowledge contained in these texts was valuable enough to risk persecution. Whether interpreted as literal supernatural power or as sophisticated psychological techniques, the grimoire tradition provided practitioners with tools they found genuinely useful for navigating complex social, intellectual, and spiritual challenges. From a modern academic perspective, Valak's historical development illustrates broader patterns in how esoteric knowledge functions in human cultures. Magical traditions serve multiple functions. They provide frameworks for understanding and manipulating uncertain situations. They create social bonds between practitioners. They preserve and transmit cultural knowledge, and they offer psychological technologies for personal development and problem-solving. The question of whether demons like Valac are real in any objective sense becomes less important than understanding how belief in such entities functions within human psychological and social systems. Whether Valac exists as an independent spiritual being or as a sophisticated psychological archetype, the historical record shows that practitioners have found the concept useful for accessing hidden information, understanding deceptive situations, and developing personal power. Contemporary academic study of grimoire traditions has revealed their remarkable sophistication. These weren't crude superstitions or primitive psychological techniques, but complex systems that integrated theology, psychology, linguistics, symbolism, and practical problem-solving strategies. Modern practitioners, whether approaching them from religious, psychological, or historical perspectives, continue to find value in these medieval spiritual technologies. The transformation of Valac from a specialized medieval magical consultant into Hollywood's terrifying nun demon represents more than just creative license. It reflects fundamental changes in how modern Western culture understands and relates to supernatural concepts. By examining this transformation, we can understand not just what we've lost in translating ancient magical traditions for contemporary audiences, but also what these traditions might still offer to modern practitioners and scholars. James Wan and the creative team behind the Conjuring franchise made several crucial decisions when adapting Valac for cinema. They stripped away his medieval context entirely, eliminated his specific magical specializations, transformed his appearance from a winged child on a dragon to a demonic nun, and reduced his complex symbolic associations to generic supernatural malevolence. These weren't arbitrary choices, they reflect Hollywood's understanding of what contemporary audiences find frightening and comprehensible. The nun imagery, in particular, reveals how modern horror relies on subverting familiar religious symbols rather than engaging with authentic occult traditions. A demonic nun triggers immediate recognition and revulsion in audiences raised in Christian cultural contexts, while a winged child riding a two-headed dragon would require explanation and cultural education that blockbuster horror films simply can't accommodate. But this transformation comes at a significant cost. It eliminates precisely what made Valac historically interesting and potentially useful. The medieval Valac wasn't a random evil entity seeking to terrorize innocent families. He was a specialized supernatural consultant with particular expertise, specific protocols for interaction, and defined limitations on his power and influence. This distinction matters enormously for understanding how magical traditions actually function versus how popular culture imagines they work. Medieval grimoire magic wasn't about battling cosmic evil or surviving supernatural attacks. It was about accessing specialized spiritual services for specific practical purposes. Practitioners approached demons like Valac the way modern people might consult attorneys, doctors, or financial advisors, as experts with particular knowledge and capabilities. The real Valac, as described in historical grimoires, offers something potentially more valuable than horror movie scares. Systematic techniques for accessing hidden information, understanding deceptive situations, and developing personal insight. Whether interpreted literally as supernatural intervention or metaphorically as sophisticated psychological technology, these traditional magical concepts provide practical tools that many modern practitioners find genuinely useful. Contemporary magical practitioners who work with Goetic entities report a wide spectrum of experiences with Valac, most of which bear little resemblance to Hollywood horror. Common reports include enhanced research capabilities. Practitioners describe improved ability to locate obscure information, make unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated data, and uncover details that others had overlooked or concealed. Improved intuition. About deception, many report developing better instincts for recognizing when people are being dishonest, manipulative, or presenting incomplete information, the modern equivalent of serpent mastery in social and professional contexts. Discovery of hidden opportunities, business opportunities, romantic connections, career possibilities, or creative projects that weren't initially obvious but proved valuable once recognized. Personal insight and self-knowledge, understanding of hidden aspects of their own personality, suppressed talents, unconscious motivations, or unexplored potential, the inner treasure interpretation of Valak's specialization. Synchronicity and information flow, increased frequency of meaningful coincidences, chance encounters that provide valuable information, or seemingly random discoveries that prove remarkably relevant. These contemporary reports suggest that whatever psychological or spiritual mechanisms underlie traditional magical practice, they continue to function effectively for modern practitioners. The question isn't necessarily whether Valac exists as an independent supernatural entity, but whether the traditional techniques for summoning him activate genuine psychological capacities for insight, intuition, and information processing. From a psychological perspective, the ritual process of invoking Valac might function as a sophisticated form of focused intention and subconscious programming. The detailed visualization of the winged child riding a two-headed dragon, the specific focus on hidden treasures and serpent mastery, the ritual preparation and formal invocation, all of these elements serve to concentrate the practitioner's attention on particular psychological states and capabilities. Modern cognitive science suggests that human beings possess remarkable unconscious information processing abilities. We constantly perceive and analyze far more data than our conscious minds can directly access. We pick up subtle social cues, notice patterns in complex information, and synthesize insights from seemingly unrelated experiences. The challenge is learning to access and trust these unconscious capabilities. Traditional magical practices like Valac invocation might represent sophisticated pre-scientific techniques for activating and directing these natural psychological processes. The symbolic framework provides a structure for organizing unconscious insights, while the ritual process creates the focused attention necessary to receive and interpret subtle information. This interpretation doesn't diminish the practical value of traditional magical techniques. It suggests that our ancestors developed remarkably sophisticated psychological technologies without needing to understand the neurological mechanisms involved. Whether Valac exists as an independent spiritual entity or as a powerful psychological archetype, the traditional techniques for working with him appear to produce genuine practical results. Contemporary chaos magic practitioners have particularly embraced this pragmatic approach to Goetic work. Rather than concerning themselves with questions of literal supernatural reality, they focus on whether traditional magical techniques produce desired outcomes. Many report that Valac-inspired practices are remarkably effective for research, investigation, and uncovering hidden information. Modern business consultants and life coaches have even begun adapting traditional divination and insight techniques, often without realizing their occult origins. The emphasis on uncovering hidden potential, revealing concealed opportunities, and navigating complex interpersonal dynamics directly parallels Valak's traditional specializations. The serpent mastery aspect of Valak's portfolio has found particularly interesting modern applications. In contemporary magical practice, this often translates to toxicity recognition, developing better instincts for identifying harmful relationships, manipulative individuals, or dangerous situations before they cause serious damage. Transformation work, using Valak's energy to facilitate personal change, break destructive patterns, or navigate difficult life transitions, drawing on the serpent's traditional association with renewal and transformation. Healing knowledge, accessing information about health, wellness, or recovery that isn't immediately obvious through conventional medical channels. Shadow integration, working with the serpentine aspects of personality, those parts of ourselves that might be hidden, dangerous, or socially unacceptable but contain important energy and insight. The seal of Valac continues to appear in contemporary magical practice, though modern practitioners often adapt traditional methods to current circumstances. While historical grimoires specify that presidential seals should be crafted in mercury due to Valak's rank, contemporary magicians typically use safer alternatives: copper plates, silver jewelry, or even digital images displayed on screens during ritual work. Some modern practitioners report success with virtual summoning techniques, using computer graphics, virtual reality, or meditation apps to create the traditional visualizations and ritual frameworks. These adaptations suggest that the essential psychological mechanisms underlying traditional magic remain functional even when expressed through modern technological interfaces. The globalization of magical practice through internet communities has created fascinating new variations in how Valac is understood and approached. Practitioners from different cultural backgrounds bring their own interpretations and techniques, creating hybrid approaches that blend traditional grimoire methods with indigenous magical traditions, Eastern meditation practices, and modern psychological frameworks. Online magical communities regularly share experiences, techniques, and results related to Valac work. These communities serve functions similar to medieval magical networks. They preserve and transmit knowledge, provide mutual support and validation, and facilitate the development of new techniques and interpretations. However, the democratization of magical knowledge through internet accessibility has also created challenges. Traditional grimoire magic was transmitted through carefully structured apprenticeship relationships, with experienced practitioners guiding newcomers through complex and potentially dangerous processes. Modern practitioners often attempt advanced magical work without adequate preparation, leading to mixed results and occasionally genuine psychological difficulties. The question of safety in demonic magic remains relevant for contemporary practitioners. Historical grimoires contain extensive warnings about the dangers of improper magical practice, and modern practitioners report a spectrum of experiences ranging from beneficial to neutral to genuinely problematic. While few contemporary magicians report the dramatic supernatural manifestations described in medieval accounts, many do describe psychological and social consequences, both positive and negative, from their magical work. Professional therapists and counselors working with clients involved in occult practices have developed frameworks for distinguishing between healthy spiritual exploration and problematic magical obsessions. The key factors appear to be integration with daily life, maintenance of critical thinking abilities, and continued engagement with mainstream social and professional responsibilities. From an academic perspective, the continued relevance of figures like Valac demonstrates the remarkable persistence of symbolic and psychological patterns across cultural boundaries and historical periods. The specific needs that medieval practitioners sought to address through Valac invocation, access to hidden information, understanding of deceptive situations, recognition of valuable opportunities, remain universal human concerns. Modern neuroscience and psychology have begun to understand some of the mechanisms that might underlie traditional magical practices. Research on meditation, visualization, focused attention, and altered states of consciousness suggests that the ritual techniques described in grimoires might indeed activate genuine psychological capacities for enhanced perception, intuition, and problem-solving. The enduring appeal of figures like Valac also reflects contemporary dissatisfaction with purely materialistic worldviews. In an era dominated by scientific rationalism and technological solutions, many people find themselves drawn to older systems that acknowledge mystery, symbol, and the limitations of purely logical approaches to complex problems.